The morning of the coronation, the bells of St. Adric's Minster rang out over Crowmore before the sun had finished clearing the eastern wall, and Elspeth Carraby stood in the cold transept with a sheaf of copied music pressed to her chest, watching a sister who was not the rightful one be carried toward the throne. She was not supposed to be near the procession at all. She had been engaged for the day only to mend the choir's torn part books and to mark the anthem where the boys lost their place, and she had taken her station in the shadow of a stone pillar where no one would notice a draper's foster ward in a plain gray gown. From there she could see the whole nave open before her, like the inside of a great pale shell, and she could see Lady Marasan moving down it under a canopy of cloth of gold, her chin lifted, her gloved hand resting on the arm of the chamberlain, the diamonds at her throat throwing little hard sparks against the morning light. The crowd had decided long ago that this was what a Margravine looked like. Elspeth did not argue with the crowd. She had learned, in 23 years, that arguing with the crowd was a luxury for people the crowd had already chosen to see. What she could not stop was the cold thing that moved through her chest when the procession passed the pillar where she stood. It was not envy. She had told herself 100 times that it was not envy, and on most mornings she believed it. It was something harder to name, a recognition that arrived in her body before it reached her mind, the way a held breath arrives before grief. She pressed the music tighter. She kept her eyes down. And still, when Lady Marasan passed within an arm's length of her, Elspeth felt the floor of her certainty tilt, very slightly. The way a deck tilts before a wave is even visible. The Duke of Windermere saw it. He was not supposed to see it either. He stood where the law required him to stand, 3 steps below the chancel rail, in a navy coat so dark it read almost black in the shadow, the white of his cravat, the only soft thing about him. As Earl Marshal of Edenswood, it fell to him to conduct the day, to time the music and the oaths and the anointing, to see that the small sovereignty of his birth crowned its Margravine without a single misplaced minute. His face gave nothing. It was a face people called cold, and his jaw held the particular stillness of a man who had taught himself stillness at a cost. When the procession passed the gray woman by the pillar, his gaze caught on her for one beat longer than the ceremony allowed, and something in him went very quiet, the way the air goes quiet before snow. Keep that beat. Hold it where you can find it again. By the end of the day it will matter more than the crown. She did not know yet why the day frightened her. Neither did he. The fear had been 6 weeks in the making, and to understand it, one must go back to its beginning. A draper's ward had come to stand in the Minster on coronation morning by a long road, and that road had opened in the 3rd week of Elspeth's service in the old music room at Crowmore before anyone had said the word that would unmake the throne. The Margraviate of Edenswood was a small country, as countries go. A green fold of hills and grey stone north of the great kingdoms, ruled for 300 years by the same house and governed, in fact, since the old Margrave's death, by his widow. Honora, the Dowager Margravine of Windermere, had held the country in her 2 hands for 11 years through a regency that everyone agreed had been firm, and now she meant to set the crown at last upon the head of the girl the country knew as her late husband's elder daughter. The succession had never been questioned. There was no reason on earth to question it. The house had its heir, the heir had her diamonds, and the people had their ceremony to look forward to. Elspeth had come to the palace by the ordinary door, the servants' door, hired by the choirmaster for a clerk's wages because she could read music faster than any man in the town, and copy a part without a single dropped rest. She had been raised by Mrs. Hartsworth, the draper's widow on Lantern Street, who had taken her in as an infant and never once explained where she had come from, beyond the words "a basket" and "a hard winter." Elspeth had stopped asking when she was 12. There were worse fates than a clean shop and a warm fire, and a woman who taught her to read by the light of a tallow candle, and Elspeth had decided early to be grateful rather than curious. Curiosity, in a girl of no family, was only another word for trouble. So she copied her anthems, and she mended her part books, and she kept her eyes down. And she would have gone on keeping them down forever, if it had not been for the household steward, Mr. Saxby, and a ledger that would not balance. Saxby was a thin, anxious man of 60, who had kept the palace accounts since before the old Margrave died, and he had the kind of memory that forgets a face in a moment and never forgets a figure. He found Elspeth one grey afternoon in the music room, bent over her copying, with the light failing, and he stood in the doorway a long while before he spoke. When he did speak, his voice had a strange tightness in it. "You have the look of someone," he said. "Forgive an old man. You have the look of the old Margravine, Lady Catherine, who died the year you would have been born. I copied her household book for 20 years. I knew her hand, and I knew her face." Elspeth set down her pen. She had been told before that she had a look of one fine lady or another, the way poor girls are always being told, and she had learned to let it pass like weather. "Mr. Barr." Saxby was not flattering her. He was frightened, and a frightened accountant is a particular thing. "There is a figure," he said, lower now, "in the book of the year of the late Margravine's confinement, a payment to a midwife at Lantern Street, made twice, in 2 different hands, 3 weeks apart, for the same lying-in. I have looked at that figure for 11 years and told myself it was a clerk's error. It is not a clerk's error. A clerk's error does not come in 2 hands. He looked at her with something close to dread. "Who took you in, child? And on what street?" She told him she watched the color leave his face. Maud! That was the first thread, and Elspeth tried for a fortnight to leave it alone. She told herself the ledger meant nothing, that an old man's eyes played tricks, that the resemblance was the kind of thing any grey woman might be told. The town of Crowmore had long ago weighed her, and found nothing worth a second glance, a copyist, a foster ward, a pair of clean hands hired by the week. She had no wish to be more. That was the truth she had built her whole quiet life upon, and she did not want it disturbed. It was disturbed all the same, and by the very person who had built her quiet life. Hartsworth, when Elspeth went home to Lantern Street and laid the steward's question before her, did not deny it. She sat down hard in her chair by the cold grate, and her old hands knotted in her apron, and she said the thing she had carried for 23 years. "You were not a basket," she said. "You were brought to me by the midwife who delivered you on the night you were born, with money enough for 10 years and an instruction never to ask the giver's name. There were 2 daughters born that winter in the house at Crowmore, 3 weeks apart, one to the Margravine and one to a lady-in-waiting who died of it. I was told only that one of them must vanish, and that the one who vanished was you." Her mouth trembled. "I did not ask which mother. I was afraid of the answer. I have been afraid of it every day since." Elspeth stood in the small dark shop and felt the floor of her certainty tilt again, further this time, and she understood at last that the cold recognition she had felt in the minster had a name, and that the name was older than she was. She did not weep. That was not her way. And besides, weeping would have changed nothing. Instead, she did the thing that her copyist's mind did with everything, which was to take the disorder apart and lay it in lines until it could be read. 2 daughters. 1 winter, 1 kept, 1 hidden. A double payment in the household book. A dying lady-in-waiting, and a Margravine who, the history said, had been delivered of a single living child, the child the country now called Lady Marasine. And, over all of it, 11 years deep, the steady governing hand of the Dowager Margravine of Windermere, who had ruled as regent on behalf of an heir, and who had every reason in the world to be certain which infant lived in the cradle and which lived on Lantern Street. What she did not yet know was that the Dowager already knew her name, for Honora of Windermere had not held the country for 11 years by failing to notice when an accountant grew uneasy. Mr. Saxby's question had not been quiet enough. Within 3 days of his speaking it, a footman in the Dowager's livery had come to the music-room and informed Elspeth, with perfect courtesy, that her services as a copyist were no longer required, and that she would be obliged to vacate her station by nightfall. It was not done with anger. The Dowager never used anger where a closed door would serve. It was the closing of the door that told Elspeth she had been seen. The Earl Marshal saw it too. The Duke of Windermere had not become Earl Marshal by ambition. He had inherited the office, as he had inherited his title and his grief, all in the same hard season, when his father had died under a shadow that the Duke had spent 10 years refusing to discuss. The old Duke had once, long ago in a council chamber, asked a question about a confinement and a register, and had been dismissed from court for asking it, and had died 3 winters later in the cold of his own estate at Windermere, called a meddler and a fool by men who were glad to be rid of an honest one. Tybalt had buried him without a word of defense, because there had been no proof, only a question, and a question without proof is a kind of poison in a small court. He had sworn at that graveside never to ask a question. He could not answer. He had kept the oath for 10 years. It had made him the cold man people thought him. It had also, he was beginning to understand, made him his father's true heir in the one way that mattered, and the understanding sat in him like a stone he could neither swallow nor spit out. He came to the music room on the evening Elspeth was dismissed, ostensibly to collect the anthem she had been copying, and he found her packing her pens into a wooden box by candlelight, her grey gown thin against the autumn cold of the stone room, her hands quite steady. He stood in the doorway a moment as Saxby had stood, and the candle threw her shadow long across the floor. "You copy a clean part," he said. His voice was level and low, the way it always was. "The choir will be the worse for losing you." "The choir," Elspeth said without looking up, "will manage. They generally do. You were dismissed today. It was not a question. By whose order?" She did set down her pen then, and she looked at him fully, the way she had not yet dared to look at him, and she was not afraid of him, which surprised them both. "You are the Earl Marshal," she said. "You know better than I do by whose order anything is done in this house." The Duke did not answer at once. He crossed the room and set a coin on the table beside her box. The proper wage for the work she had done, and his gloved hand was very near hers, and neither of them moved it away for a moment longer than was strictly required. Then he said in the same level voice, "Eat something before you go home. The cold is bad tonight." And he turned and left her, and Elspeth stood holding the coin and reading the dismissal of it as coldness, exactly as he intended her to, and not yet able to read the protection underneath. He had told her to eat because he had seen the thinness of her wrist, and because his father's grief had taught him that a person in danger is fed first and counseled after. She did not know that. She knew only that a duke had looked at her too long and then told her to go home, and that her hand still felt where his had nearly touched it. What neither of them spoke aloud that night was the resemblance. The Duke had spent his whole adult life avoiding the question his father died asking, and here it stood in a music room, in a grey gown, copying anthems for a clerk's wage, with the late Margravine's brow and the late Margravine's serious mouth, and the Duke felt the oath he had sworn at a graveside begin, very quietly, to crack. The Dowager moved first, and she moved well. She did not deny the rumor that Mr. Saxby's uneasiness had set loose among the upper servants, because a denial gives a rumor weight. Instead, she had the household book brought to her private cabinet, and she had the page of the late Margravine's confinement carefully removed, and a new page bound in its place, copied in a clean, unhurried hand, showing a single payment to a single midwife for a single living child. She summoned the registrar, Mr. Welland, an old client of her house who owed his post to her favor, and she had the parish register of that winter brought to Windermere Castle for what she called safekeeping. And she sent for Mrs. Hartsworth. The draper's widow was an old woman with a weak chest, and the Dowager did not threaten her, because the Dowager never threatened where a kindness would serve better. She offered her a cottage by the sea, and a pension for life, and the comfort of knowing that a foolish old confusion need trouble no one, and she let Mrs. Hartsworth understand, without a single hard word, that the cottage and the pension were the gentle road, and that there was a less gentle road for women who told stories about the succession 3 weeks before a coronation. Hartsworth went home to Lantern Street and sat by her cold grate and wept, and when Elspeth came to her she could not meet the girl's eyes. "You must let it go," the old woman said. "Whatever you are alive and you are free. And there are women in the ground for less than what you are thinking of doing. Let them have their crown. It was never yours to want." To the dowager, the matter was finished. Elspeth was a copyist, with no family and no proof, a resemblance and a rumor. And resemblances and rumors had been managed before. The book was rebound. The register was at Windermere. The midwife who had attended the births was 11 years dead, and the draper's widow was bought, and the accountant was old and afraid. There was no document left in the world that said Elspeth Carrowby was anyone at all. The dowager went to her chapel and gave thanks for an orderly country and slept well, and that was the cruelest thing about her, that she was not cruel, only certain. Only a woman protecting an order she had been raised to believe was the same thing as the good. She had forgotten Mr. Saxby's memory. That was her single human error, and it was not negligence, for she had thought of the accountant and judged him harmless. He was old, he was timid, he was loyal to his wages, and she had let him keep his post, precisely so that his sudden dismissal might not stir the very rumor she was smothering. She had calculated him correctly, in every particular but one. She had assumed that a timid man would never act. What she had not weighed was that Mr. Saxby had copied the late Margravine's household book for 20 years, and loved her memory more than he feared the living, and that a man like that, given the rebound page to copy, would notice instantly that the page was new, and would remember, line for line. Elspeth found him in the muniment room 3 days before the coronation, on the pretext of returning a copied anthem, and he closed the door behind her and spoke very fast and very low. "They have changed the book," he said. "I was made to copy the new page yesterday. The old page is gone, but the old page was in my hand for 20 years, and I will set down every figure of it from memory, and swear to it on any Bible they bring me. It is not enough. A clerk's memory against a Margravine is nothing. There is a register, though, child. Every birth in Crowmore was entered in the parish register of this minster, in the registrar's hand, witnessed by 2. If 2 daughters were born that winter, the register said so before anyone thought to hide it, and Welland cannot have unwritten what 2 witnesses already signed. He can only hide the book, and he has hidden it," Elspeth said. "At Windermere, in the dowager's own muniment room, behind a door she keeps locked, with her own seal upon it. I have seen the seal. No one breaks the dowager's seal and keeps his place." Saxby's hands were shaking. "I am sorry. I have given you a truth I cannot give you the proof of. I am an old man, and I have made you a target for nothing." Elspeth stood in the cold muniment room and understood the shape of the trap, entire. The truth existed. It had been written, witnessed, signed, and it sat behind the dowager's seal in a locked room in a castle, a half-day's ride from Crowmore, guarded by a household that owed everything to the woman who had hidden it, 3 days before the crown would be set forever upon her sister's head. After the anointing, no register on earth would matter. A crowned Margravine was a fact, and facts do not unmake themselves. The dowager had not hidden the truth out of carelessness. She had hidden it precisely behind a seal in a guarded room, with a forged page ready to discredit anyone who spoke. She had foreseen everything a frightened accountant might do. What she had not foreseen was the Earl Marshal. For the duty of conducting the coronation gave the Earl Marshal a power the dowager had reckoned harmless, because she had reckoned him as cold and obedient as his reputation. The Earl Marshal alone could call for the rolls of the realm to be present at the anointing. He alone, by an old and forgotten article of the coronation rite, could require the Margravine to be crowned only after the recital of her descent had been read aloud from the baptismal register kept at St. Adric's, the very article under which his father had once disastrously asked his question. The dowager had read the rite 100 times and dismissed the article as a dead letter. No one had invoked in a century. She had not reckoned that the man holding the office was the son of the last man who had tried. The Duke came to Lantern Street himself, on foot, in the dark, the night before the coronation. It was a thing no duke did, and Elspeth opened the shop door to him, with a candle in her hand, and her hair down. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The rain had soaked through the shoulders of his dark coat. The cold had reddened his hands. He looked, standing on the worn step of a draper's shop, less like the cold Earl Marshal of Edensward, and more like a man who had walked a long way toward something he had spent 10 years walking away from. "I knew your face the moment I saw it," he said. The level voice was not quite level now. "I have known it for 6 weeks, and told myself I did not. My father asked a question once about a winter and a register, and they buried him for it, and I swore I would never ask a question I could not answer." He drew a breath. "I can answer this one. I have read the right. There is a way to make the truth be spoken in the one place where the dowager cannot smother it in the minster, before the whole country, at the moment of the crowning. I cannot do it. On a resemblance alone, I need the register. And the register is behind her seal." "Then we cannot have it," Elspeth said. "Mr. Saxby has told me no one breaks the dowager's seal. No one of her household," the Duke said. "But the registrar, Welland, is not of her household. He is of mine, by an older debt she has forgotten. His father held his living of my father, and Welland has carried for 10 years the shame of having let the register be taken to Windermere, against every rule of his office." Something almost like warmth moved across the Duke's hard face then, and it was gone before it had fully arrived. A man who has carried a shame for 10 years will sometimes risk everything to set it down. I know that better than most. I have only to ask him, and to ask him I had first to be willing to ask the question my father died asking. I have spent 10 years not being willing. He looked at her in the candlelight, the rain on his lashes. "You have made me willing. I do not know how to thank you for that, so I will not try. Come inside. The cold is bad tonight." It was the second time he had told her to come in out of the cold, and this time Elspeth heard, underneath the command, the thing it had always meant, and she stepped back and led him into Mrs. Midgey Hardsworth's small warm shop, and the door closed behind him against the rain. They sat by the fire the old woman had at last consented to light, and they did not touch, for that was not the country they lived in, but the Duke turned his hat in his hands, and told her about his father, the meddler and the fool, who had been neither. And Elspeth told him about a basket that had never been a basket. And somewhere in the telling, the long habit of her solitude and the long habit of his silence came to rest against one another like two cold hands finding, at last, a single warmth between them. The morning came gray and clear. The bells rang. The country put on its coronation, and Elspeth Caraby took her place in the shadow of the stone pillar with a sheaf of copied music against her chest, in the same cold transept where the bells had found her at dawn, and watched the sister who was not the rightful heir carried toward the throne. Now, though she knew why the cold thing moved in her chest, and she knew, too, that a quiet man in a navy coat stood 3 steps below the chancel rail, with a folded paper inside his coat, and an old article of the right ready on his tongue, and that whether the record was ever spoken aloud in that vast bright nave depended now upon a frightened registrar and a single broken seal. Mr. Welland had broken it. That was the thing Elspeth could not know from the shadow of her pillar, but it was true, and it had cost the old man more than his post. He had ridden to Windermere in the dark, on the Duke's authority, and his own 10-year shame, and he had stood before the dowager's locked door, and he had set his hand to the seal of the woman who had made him, and broken it, and taken from the muniment room the register of that long-ago winter, with its 2 entries 3 weeks apart, witnessed and signed, that no clean rebound page could unwrite. He had carried it through the night to the minster, and given it into the Earl Marshal's hands at the western door as the bells began. And then he had stood at the back of the nave with the ruin of his career in his face, and the peace of a discharged debt in his eyes, and waited. The dowager saw none of it. She sat in the front of the choir, in gray silk and the diamonds of her house, watching the girl she had raised move toward the throne. and there was in her face, for one unguarded moment, a thing that was almost tenderness. The rival, Lady Melisande, was no schemer. She had been told her whole life that she was the heir, had been measured for the crown as a child, had learned the oaths at her foster mother's knee, and she walked the nave that morning believing every step of it, because no one had ever given her cause to believe otherwise. She was the dowager's single act of love, and the lie had been told first of all to her. The anthem ended. Elspeth's own copied notes died away into the high stone vault. The archpriest rose with the holy oil, and the canopy was drawn back, and Lady Melisande knelt upon the worn step before the chair. Her house had occupied for 300 years, her fair head bowed, her diamonds very bright. And the Earl Marshal stepped forward to the chancel rail, into the silence that the law gave him, and lifted his level voice so that it carried to the last cold corner of the minster. By the ancient article of this rite, the Duke said, no Margravine of Edenswood is anointed until her descent is read aloud from the parish register of this minster, witnessed and entire, before the people who are her witnesses this day. There was a stir in the choir. The dowager's head turned slowly, and her face did not change. But Elspeth, watching from the pillar, saw her gloved hand close very tightly upon the carved arm of her chair. She is calculating, Elspeth thought. She is already finding the door she will close on this. And the dowager was. She rose with perfect composure and said in a clear, polished, hierarchy-protective voice that filled the nave as easily as the Duke's, the article is a dead letter, my Lord Marshal, unread for 100 years, and the register is at Windermere for its keeping. We will not delay a coronation for a parchment that is not in the room. The register is in the room, the Duke said, and he drew the folded book from inside his coat. That was the moment the day turned, and it turned not with a shout, but with a silence so complete that Elspeth could hear the candles. The dowager's composure did not break. She was far too well made for that. She crossed the chancel toward the Duke with her hand already out, and she said, low and swift and still polished, that book was taken from my keeping by theft. It is no evidence. It is the proof of a crime, and the man who broke my seal will answer for it, and you with him. My lord before this day is out. It was a good defense. It was, Elspeth thought, almost a brilliant one, for it was true that the seal had been broken, and a court that loved order more than truth might well have let her stand on it. The dowager did not deny the register. She moved instead to make the register a fruit of theft, to drown the truth in the lesser crime, and she very nearly did. What undid her was not the Duke, and it was not luck, and it was not the register, which a clever advocate might still have argued away. What undid her was Elspeth, for Elspeth Carrowby stepped out from the shadow of the stone pillar into the open nave, in her plain gray gown with the choir's copied music still in her hand, and she walked into the light below the chancel where the whole country could see her, and she did not raise her voice. Because she had never in her life needed to raise her voice to be exactly understood. She stood beside the kneeling girl in cloth of gold, and the resemblance between them, which a pillar's shadow had hidden, stood revealed in the bright vault for every soul in the minster to read at once. The same brow, the same serious mouth, the late Margravine's face worn by two daughters born 3 weeks apart in the same hard winter. Read it, Elspeth said. 2 words, quietly, into the silence. Whatever the cost of the broken seal, the seal was broken over the truth. Read what was written before anyone thought to hide it, and let the people who are her witnesses decide which of us their old Margravine bore. The dowager turned on her, and for the first time in 11 years the polished voice fractured. You are a copyist, she said. You are a draper's foundling, a basket on a doorstep. You are nothing. You are nothing that the law can hear. She said it 3 ways because the certainty had begun to fail her, and the people heard the failing, the way a congregation always hears it when a confident voice begins to repeat itself. The dismissal that had served her for 23 years, the verdict of nothing, came apart in her mouth, in the one place it could not be made to hold. The archpriest who answered to no living noble but to the right alone, took the register from the Earl Marshal's hand. He read the entries of that winter aloud, in the slow, flat voice of a man reading a record. 2 daughters of the house at Crowmore. 3 weeks apart, the elder to the Margravine, and entered as the heir. The younger to a lady-in-waiting who died of her lying in. Each witnessed, each signed, in the registrar's own undoubted hand. And then he read the household book that Mr. Saxby had reconstructed from 20 years of memory, and sworn to before the assembled court. The double payment, the midwife of Lantern Street, the infant carried away in the night. The 2 records, the register and the ledger, lay together in the silence, and made between them a thing no broken seal could unmake. The heir had been carried away. The kept daughter was not the elder. The country had brought the younger to the throne, and left the true-born in a grey gown in the shadows. And now the true-born stood beside her sister in the light, asking only that the record be read. Lady Marizanne rose from the worn step. She turned, the diamonds trembling at her throat, and she looked at Elspeth with a face from which the whole certainty of a life was draining away. And there was no malice in it, only the particular grief of a person discovering that the love that raised her had been built upon a theft. She did not rage. She had been raised gently, whatever else had been done to her, and gentleness held even now. She looked from Elspeth to the dowager and back, and in that single look, she understood everything, and forgave nothing, and pitied everyone. And then she stepped down from the step she had knelt upon, and the crown that had not yet touched her head remained, very bright, upon its cushion, untouched. The Earl Marshal crossed the chancel. He did not make a speech. Pray. One, he had sworn, long ago, never to ask a question he could not answer. And now that the answer lay open in the slow voice of the archpriest, the only thing left to him was the smallest sufficient act, and he made it, and no more. He stopped before Elspeth, in the sight of the whole country, and he said her name, as he had never said it before, her given name plainly, in his level voice. As a man claims a thing he means to keep, Elspeth, he said. And then, 4 words only, in the same place where the hierarchy had rendered its verdict of nothing. This is your house. That was all. He did not humiliate the dowager beyond the displacement her own overreach had earned. He did not match her certainty with cruelty. He claimed the truth, and he claimed it in the arena where the lie had been told, and the minimum was enough, because the truth had done the rest. The dowager did not fall. The order she had served did not permit her a public ruin, and the country she had governed for 11 years was not minded to give her one. For there is no appetite in a small nation for the destruction of a woman who has, for all her crime, kept the peace. She was corrected and displaced and quietly humbled, which is a harder thing than ruin and a truer one. She withdrew to Windermere, to the seat from which she took her name, and there she lived out her years, in a kind of orderly exile, governing a household instead of a country, and it was said that she never once spoke of the coronation, and that she was kind, in her cold way, to the end, which was the saddest verdict of all, upon a woman who had wanted only to protect an order and had mistaken the order for the good. Lady Marizanne did not vanish either, and Elspeth would not permit it. That was the first act of the new Margravine, before any oath, before any anointing, and she made it without consulting a single counselor. She crossed to the girl she had displaced, and took her gloved hand, the hand that had worn the diamonds, and she said, low enough that only Marizanne could hear it, that whatever the registers said, the 2 of them had been born of the same winter, and the same grief, and that there was room in one house for 2 daughters of it. She named her sister. She did not name her rival. And Marizanne, who had lost a crown and a mother and the whole certainty of her life in the space of a single morning, looked at the grey woman who had every right to send her away, and found that she was not being sent away, and the thing that had been draining from her face stopped draining, and something quieter and more durable began, very slowly, to take its place. They did not finish the coronation that day. A country cannot crown a Margravine in the morning, and uncrown her by noon, and crown another before the candles are out. There are forms and proofs, and the slow procedural justice of a small nation that loves its order. The register was sworn to. Mr. Saxby gave his memory to the council, and was believed. And the old man wept when they believed him, for he had loved a dead Margravine for 20 years, and had at last been allowed to serve her. Mr. Rock's been allowed to serve her. Veland answered for the broken seal, as he had known he would, and lost the post he had shamed for 10 years, and walked out of the council chamber with the lightest step Elspeth had ever seen in a ruined man, because a debt long carried had at last been set down. Mrs. Jereps Hartsworth, the draper's widow who had taken a vanished child and raised her by the light of a tallow candle, was brought to court in a new grey shawl and seated where she could see, and when the council named Elspeth the true-born elder daughter of the house at Crowmore, the old woman did not weep, but her old hands found Elspeth's and held them. And that was enough. If Elspeth's quiet held you until the end, stay a moment longer in the warm small rooms where it settled. The grand arena has had its say. The rest belongs to the fire. She was crowned in the spring when the bare trees about Crowmore had put out their first green, and the bells of St. Adric's rang again over a country that had had a winter to make its peace with the truth. It was a quieter coronation than the first. There were fewer diamonds and more witnesses, and the people who lined the nave had decided, in their slow collective way, that the grey woman who had stepped from the shadow of a pillar and asked only that a record be read was a thing they could trust to wear a crown. And the crowd, when it is finally awakened, is generally sound. Lady Marasan walked behind her sister in the procession, not as a displaced heir, but as the Margravine's own, and carried the train of the gown, and there was in her face that morning a peace that the first morning's diamonds had never given her. The Duke of Lindemere stood 3 steps below the chancel rail, where the law required him to stand, in the same dark navy coat, and conducted the rite without a single misplaced minute, as an Earl Marshal must. Once, though, as the holy oil was brought and the canopy drawn back, and Elspeth knelt at last upon the worn step her house had occupied for 300 years, his level gaze caught hers, and the hard stillness of his face broke for the length of a single breath into something the whole country would have called, had they seen it, the nearest thing to joy that a cold man ever permits himself. And then it was gone. And he was the Earl Marshal again, timing the music. It did not matter that it was gone. Elspeth had seen it. She had learned, long ago, to read the protection underneath the coldness, and she read it now. They were married before the leaves turned again quietly at Lindemere, in the small grey chapel where the old duke who had asked the dangerous question lay buried. The meddler and the fool who had been neither, vindicated at last by a son who had finished what he started. Tybalt stood at his father's grave the morning of the wedding. Alone, in the navy coat, the golden autumn light falling across the stones, and he said something there that no one heard. And when he came back into the chapel, his face was wet. And Elspeth did not ask, because she did not need to. She had a face of her own that had learned to keep its grief, and she knew the look of a debt, set down. The coda of this is small as the truest things are small. On a winter evening at Lindemere, a year on from the morning the bells rang over a false crowning, the new Margravine of Edenswood sat by the fire with her husband's hand in hers, and her sister across the hearth mending a torn part-book. The choir's music that had begun all of it. The same anthem Elspeth had been copying in a cold room, when an old accountant told her she had the look of someone. The snow came down past the dark windows. Mrs. Hartsworth dozed in the warm corner with her new shawl about her shoulders. And on the small table beside the fire lay the wooden box of pens Elspeth had been packing by candlelight the night a duke told her, for the first of 2 times, to come in out of the cold. She had kept the box. She would always keep it. She had been a copyist who asked for nothing. A foundling the season had decided was nothing. A grey woman in the shadow of a stone pillar, and she had asked, in the end, for only one thing in the whole bright minster, that a true record be read aloud. It had been read, the fire burned, the snow fell. There! Her husband's thumb moved once, slowly, across the back of her hand, and her sister hummed the anthem under her breath, half a phrase, and left it hanging in the warm air, unfinished, the way the best evenings are, and Elspeth Carrowby, who had at last been seen, closed her eyes in the firelight, and was for the first time in 23 years entirely at home.